this is an example of a book that was like a fun read, but it like fundamentally altered the way I saw the world in a way that like made it richer and fuller and more interesting.
Welcome to Shoulda Books, the podcast about all the books you should have read by now. My name is Jonathan, and today I am talking to YouTuber, film essayist, filmmaker, Thomas Flight. Thomas is someone who honestly has really shaped the way that I think and see the world, both through our friendship, but also through his work over on his YouTube channel at Thomas Flight, where he makes just brilliant, exquisite essays about film and television and the theory and craft that go into these works of art. I can't recommend his channel enough. He also has a newsletter, which you can find at seeingthroughfilm.com. There's going to be links to all of this in the description, obviously. Thomas and I have had so many conversations like the one you're about to hear throughout the years, and so it was a real privilege and just a fun time to be able to share that with you. And I can't wait for you to hear it. But first, if you are enjoying Shoulda Books, please give it a like, a share, a review, or you know what? Just tell someone about it. I mean, that's certainly how I've found a lot of the things that I like, especially through Thomas. So many movies and books that I've found over the years, I've checked out because he said, hey, you should check this out. So if you are enjoying this show, it would mean the world to me if you did that for this. Also, the Shoulda Book Club. If you are interested in reading along with us, head on over to Fable. You can see our ongoing discussion this month about Isabel Allende's The House of the Spirits. I just finished the book. It was beautiful. It was brutal. It was stomach churning. It was heartwarming. It was incredible. And I can't wait to share that with all of you. That episode is coming out January 31st, but you can see the conversation that we're having over on Fable. But without any further ado, here's my conversation with Thomas. Let's hit the books. Thomas Flight, welcome to Shoulda Books. How you doing?
Hi, Jonathan. I'm doing great.
What have you been reading lately?
The book I most recently finished was The Burnout Society by...
Oh, Byung-Chul Han.
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
I felt like I was being read to a T.
Yeah.
Like he taps into some kind of something that I didn't have language for and immediately was like, oh yes, this makes so much sense.
Yeah, I find I've read Burnout Society. I've read In the Swarm by him. And here's the thing, I want to really love him, but I find like somehow it's either going over my head or there's not much there. Like it feels like
Sure.
he will like make these statements that are kind of like truisms, and then he'll tack another one onto that, and it's like is there something deeper going on here? I'm not sure. What are your thoughts on him?
Well, I mean, I can't say too much because I've only read The Burnout Society, and then I started Psychopolitics.
Okay.
And yeah, I think it's like the core idea at the center of The Burnout Society was very revelatory to me, but it felt like he like presented that idea well and then did a lot of like talking around it that didn't necessarily like expound on it too much for me.
Yeah.
And now going into Psychopolitics, I'm like, oh, he's treading some of the same ground here and in a slightly different way. So I'm curious to explore his work more, but like the core idea, the thing with philosophy and nonfiction in general, I think is interesting is like sometimes the ideas are very profound, but the writer or the writing is not necessarily as enjoyable or the best way of conveying that idea. And those are kind of two things that sometimes you have to separate out. So I would say that about The Burnout Society, where like not necessarily like a phenomenal book in terms of just like how it was written or how those ideas are expressed, but like the central core idea that we're like move into a realm of like exploiting ourselves because we have so much opportunity, and we move from like a society where we're disciplined and our lives are defined by like what we're not allowed to do, into one where we just have infinite like freedom in a sense, and then that sort of puts us in a position to exploit ourselves because we feel like we should do everything,
right,
is like an idea that I think does have like some truth and significance to it.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that there's probably not a better example of self-exploitation than starting a podcast, but I know that we've known each other for many years and have talked about books many times. I know that you read just a lot. I know you read a lot of philosophy, but you also read a lot of like communication theorists, and I know you're a big Susan Sontag head. If you had to break down the pie chart of the books that you read, what percentage are those kind of books? What percentage are philosophy? What percentage are fun, maybe?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, for a while in my mind, I kind of I had like dual tracks going where I was like, I want to have like a fiction like novel going, and then like some kind of nonfiction I'm working on as well. That's kind of broken down. I'm like a super chaotic reader. I like start stuff and then never finish it. I like start things and then put them down for like a year and then come back to it later. I'm just like all over the place. It's chaos. So turning that into some kind of pie chart would be really difficult, but it's probably like 75% nonfiction.
Okay.
And like a solid like quarter or 50% of that is like media theory or stuff about film. And then the other 25% is just like nonfiction that has nothing to do with like my core interests or work. And then another 25% is just like reading like novels or sci-fi or that kind of thing for pleasure or whatever.
Well, I'm going to add something else to the pie chart today.
Okay.
So the way this normally works is if we're recording in person, I wrap up a book in brown paper, hand it across the table, and the person at the end of the episode rips it open. We're recording this remotely, and could I have mailed something to you so that you could have an unboxing moment right here? Sure, I could have, but you know how life gets in the way. So instead, what I've done is I've sent you a text with the name of a book, but I don't want you to read that text till the end of this episode, and we'll find out if this is a book that you will find interesting. So
this is my virtual brown
This is the
paper.
virtual unboxing, yeah. So I've asked you to bring in 3 books that you think everyone should read. What is the first one?
All right. This is a hard, I mean, I'm sure everybody says this, but this is a hard sort of breakdown. There's a lot of books that are competing for this position. So am I allowed to kind of like talk about maybe my decision-making process as well?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I wanted to bring some kind of media theory book, since that's something that I have a big focus on. There was a number of options here. Some of the ones I considered, one I really love is John Berger's Ways of Seeing, which is something I think everybody should check out. Although I ended up not opting for the book because I think the book is kind of a adaptation of the television series Ways of Seeing, and I think it's actually better to watch. So while there is a book form of this and his writing is great, and I think more people need to read John Berger, I ended up not opting for the book there.
Okay. I like how you're cheating and you're bringing in like
a ton of stuff.
A ton of books. And I'm all for it.
Okay.
So John Berger, Ways of Seeing. What's that about? Just very quickly.
Basically, this is kind of the seminal work that in a lot of ways like defined what we now think of as the male gaze. So he goes back to the tradition of European painting and kind of does this like analysis of the way those images capture a certain idea, the way they were painted, like show us a way of seeing the world. And he's kind of presenting this premise that like that's what all art does. All art kind of captures the way that the artist is seeing and it codes that into the art. And then he uses that to like give us this analysis of the male gaze specifically in like the European painting tradition. And then he starts attaching that to like advertising and print, and it's kind of a brilliant work of like art criticism and media theory, and one that's still like incredibly relevant today.
Okay, but that's not the book.
But that's not it.
That is not book number one.
I'll limit this to like 3 examples, and this is the one where I have the most different ones competing. The other thing that I really considered doing, I also think everybody should read, is Marshall McLuhan's short little book called "The Medium is the Massage." An inventory of effects. And this is kind of like, there's like pictures. It's like a kind of poetic condensation of Marshall McLuhan's like key ideas. A lot of his other written work is like very dense and more academic. And this is kind of just like a fun trip through like opening up your mind to different ways of thinking about technology and media and mediums. So not heavy, dense analysis, very nonlinear, very strange, but also worthwhile.
So Marshall McLuhan, he was a media theorist, and he's famous for the phrase, "the medium is the message."
Yes.
Right. Okay. So this is a different text than that. Is that from a book, or is that just from like lectures he gave?
I'm not sure where that phrase, which book of his that phrase originated in. But it's this, he doesn't have a book called "The Medium is the Message."
Okay.
This one's like a play on his own saying.
Yeah. Okay.
Because he also like the play on words is also kind of like the media like massages you,
right.
Like it shapes you by how it sort of, I don't know, it's hard to describe. So yeah, I think the key, like more academic, like main work of his is understanding media, which goes through like how do we look at television and cinema and radio and print and all of these things and understand what they are. And the core idea there is that like the way to really understand mediums and what they are and the influence they have on us is not in the content that's conveyed through them. So like if we're talking about a book, the content would be the words on the page and the story in the page. But he is saying like, no, the way books actually influence society as a whole is less about the individual contents of the book and more about the way, like when we shift to consuming content or media through the medium of a book, we shift into linear language as being like the primary way we're like conveying and ingesting information. And then that changes how we perceive the world, how we arrange the world, how we think, and that the like core mediums that we're consuming, that like those shape society in like meaningful ways. So very like profound, I think, interesting idea for how to understand the modern world, like how to understand the shift from like a like one of the things he talks about a lot is in the 50s, like when he was kind of writing a lot and most prominent, a big shift was happening from like a literary dominant, text print dominant society to like a television society, visual. And there was this huge shift happening. And he was kind of commentating on like the impact of that shift on society. And so I think that way of like looking at the world and looking at media is still very important today. Like if you think about like how is social media, Instagram, TikTok, AI, like shaping the world. Like, it's not just about like the individual pictures or pieces of media or articles or whatever that we're seeing on those platforms. It's like what those platforms do to us and the way we consume that content. So anyway, this is kind of front loading a lot of what is in my first recommendation here, which is Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death. You saw it coming.
I saw it coming. Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman.
By Neil Postman.
I love this book. I've read it. I think I've read it twice, but take it away.
Neil Postman kind of picks up some of the ideas that Marshall McLuhan is developing and applies them in this book very specifically to television. So he's writing, I think, in the 70s, maybe a little bit later than that, about TV, and he's analyzing the medium of TV as a medium. So kind of taking McLuhan's approach, like asking what is the message of this medium, and then like doing an in-depth analysis of that, and really talking about like how the format of television kind of constrains and shapes the type of conversations that you can have on TV, how like advertising sort of like influences the way we perceive what's on television. All of these like really interesting ideas. And so you might be thinking, okay, it's a movie or it's a book about TV. How is this relevant to everybody now? We watch way less TV, you know. But I think weirdly, this is like one of the best sort of analysis of the problem with like a lot of social media that I've also ever written. Like he wrote it before the internet even existed, but a lot of what he describes here as sort of how television sort of subtly like pushes everything towards being a form of entertainment, and how the necessity of like advertising kind of like constrains the kinds of conversations that we're able to have on television, is like a really great breakdown of a lot of the limitations that like Twitter, Instagram, all of the social media that we consume have.
Yeah, what I really like about Postman is that he looked at things systematically, and he created kind of a framework that you can, like you said, apply it to whatever the dominant form of media in your day is, you know.
Yes,
and in the beginning of the book, if I remember correctly, he talks about how like the original form of mass media, if we're defining mass media as communicating across a distance versus just, you know, sitting in face to face with each other, was smoke signals. So you could send smoke signals across distance. You can send a lot of information that way. You can say, hey, the enemy's coming. You can say, hey, there's good hunting over here, but you can't have a philosophical treatise. There's limitations to what a medium can convey. And I think that that's really important to apply to the moment we're in right now, where we're in kind of a short form dominant, but quickly evolving into like AI slop dominant, like media ecosystem. And so it's like, what conversations can be had that way, what conversations can't be had that way. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind and to inquire about.
And how the medium, like what kind of content, what kind of figures it selects for. One of the things that I think really relevant from his analysis in here is he talks about like political debates, like presidential candidate debates. And he kind of talks about how once debates began to be televised, this was suddenly this opportunity for a certain kind of character that's entertaining or charismatic in a certain way to suddenly for that element of the candidate to be important in a way that it might never have been before, when you were mostly hearing about a candidate through the newspaper or just seeing photos of them. Suddenly there's this like a debate happens. That's how a lot of people are seeing a candidate, and it's happening on television, and it's in this like almost sports-like context in how it's presented, and then that really shapes like the kind of people who are going to be succeeding on those platforms. And you look at it in this book, and he's talking about debates that if you went back and watched those, they'd look incredibly like dry and stiff by today's standards.
Absolutely.
But it's so prescient, because like you watch a debate from the last several years, and it's like, we literally have the reality television president now. And it's like, how much of that arises out of like television being the world and like pushing things towards that.
Yeah.
Like that being what succeeds in that space, in that medium. And it's so relevant today too with the internet. It's like the algorithm, certain figures, certain things, certain people rise to the top because that's what the medium itself like sort of like attracts or pushes. So yeah, great book. For not really about for, I mean, it'll help you understand TV, but I think it's like the best application of like McLuhan's ideas and can be like, the kind of book that you read and then you'll like, it'll expand the way you see all media, I think.
The other thing that I really like that Postman talked about, and I don't know if he discussed it in Amusing Ourselves to Death, but I remember watching a lecture. I went down that YouTube rabbit hole one time, talking about technology and how important it is to the important question when new technology is on the scene is not what problem is this solving, it's whose problem is this solving.
Yes, yeah.
You know, and so I think that like that's what we're seeing right now with like the AI boom is like, okay, whose problem is this solving? And it's like it's solving the problems of shareholders and billionaires who don't want to pay for as many employees. You know, it's solving for people who live in, you know, urban affluent areas who don't want to talk to an Uber driver with Waymo. You know, it's like those are the problems that are getting solved and not the problems of like working class people, you know, certainly not the problems of like immigrants and the you know, the poor at large. Like, I think that's such an important question to ask when we're dealing with anything related to tech. And I say this as, you know, as a very proud Luddite who is remotely recording right now. But when did you first read that book?
I first read it, I think back in it was before 2020.
Okay.
2018, 2019, somewhere around there.
Yeah. What was going on in your life at that time?
I don't remember. I mean, I was getting more into YouTube, you know, more into that world. And I think it was around the time where the like shortcomings of social media were really starting to become more evident to a lot of people. I think, you know, broadly as a culture, we were certainly not as skeptical as I think a lot of people are now. But we were beginning to like look at things like Twitter, you know, and Facebook more critically, and really think about like what, you know, the Cambridge Analytica stuff from Facebook was happening. Right. You know, yeah, I forget what was going on around that time, but
yeah, it was a couple years after Snowden. Like,
yeah, Snowden.
It was this weird kind of this little interregnum between like the 2016 election, which I think was the real kind of like wake up call to a lot of people of just like, because nobody thought Trump. Well, not no one, but like general consensus was that Trump was a joke. He wasn't going to get elected. Yeah. And then he won, and it's like, oh, because of the internet. And so it became this moment between that and then the onset of like TikTok and these algorithms that are like orders of magnitude more powerful in terms of like serving and recommending content. Like it feels kind of quaint in a way of like looking back at like, I don't know, 2018 like social media, where it was in like the railing that I did at the time against Instagram, and it's just like, oh my god, I would love to go back to that era of Instagram. That would be great. Exactly. But you know, that's just me being a curmudgeon. But this is a great book. We're off to a great start.
And I should say one last thing. Like I was talking about, you know, McLuhan's work being kind of academic, and this is super accessible. Like it's short. It's like you have no excuse not to read it. It's a really easy read. You're not going to be like, what is he talking about? Yeah.
Okay. So what is book number 2?
Book number 2. I won't front load with a bunch of alternatives.
Please do.
Oh, you want the okay?
I mean, speed run. Let's speed run.
Speed
it real
run.
quick. Yeah.
I thought about. I really wanted to do an Ursula K. Le Guin book. Maybe
okay, cool.
The Dispossessed or Left Hand of Darkness. But both of those I read like a while ago, and while they are great, they were a little like too foggy, I think, to like talk about.
Okay.
So yeah, I thought about Ursula K. Le Guin. There's also a book I really love by Adrian Tchaikovsky called Children of Time, which is a science fiction. So those are all my science fiction picks. We won't get into that.
Okay.
But ultimately, I decided to go with The Overstory by Richard Powers. Here. Have you read this?
Yeah, I have not. No,
okay.
I've heard great things about it.
The Overstory is about, there's like 9 different characters, kind of interweaves through all those characters' stories. But really the thing that ties the narrative together, that connects all of these different characters as they progress through the book, is trees and their relationship to trees. And this book is my pick because it was a great read. I enjoyed reading the book, but it also like changed how I see trees. And trees are something that I've always loved. I grew up in a pretty like rural environment with a lot of woods and trees around, and like I loved hanging out in the woods. I loved the trees, and it always like pained me when there was like logging and clear cutting happening. So I just like in my childhood was like being molded into like a tiny little tree hugger by like the logging industry that surrounded the area where I lived. But I never like learned anything about trees. They were just kind of there. And anyway, then I read this book. He like towards the beginning of the book, he talks about the chestnuts and the chestnut blight. And they were a tree that like covered, the East Coast of America at one point. And, basically with colonialism came a blight that like killed off all of these trees, and then there was a lot of logging. And so there's this like there's this like world, the tree that like defined the landscape of the East Coast of America was this huge tree that just like basically doesn't exist anymore. It's starting to come back in some places. They've figured out how to make blight resistant forms of it. But anyway, he weaves together like nonfiction appreciation for trees and what they are, and like the way forests work, and how like mycelial mushroom networks and like trees work together to communicate with each other, and like large spans of time, and all of these things interspersed with like a bunch of human characters who are just like going about their lives trying to accomplish different things, and the ways in which like trees intersect with those people.
That's incredible. Yeah, I've heard about this book before, and I knew it was about trees. As cool as that sounds, like that doesn't scream like compelling narrative to me.
Sure.
Like how is this crafted narratively?
I think based on that description, you might read it and be surprised how much it is just actually about humans. Like, like trees are a character in the sense that they are like this thread kind of binding the whole thing together. But it is really grounded in like human stories. And it's been a little while since I read it. So, relaying all of those, but there's like a video game designer who is designing this world. There's a scientist, and it's like those stories are compelling and well written and ground the narrative in character. It is like kind of interspersed, or not non-linear, but it's shifting back and forth between multiple characters and then following them over time as the book progresses.
Gotcha.
So it is grounded in like, it's not like completely it's not like the tree itself is somehow embodied as like this character and it's all just poetic language about trees. It is just like a human narrative.
Gotcha.
But trees are just kind of the underlying like fundamental like theme.
What's the coolest tree you've ever seen in person?
Ooh, that's a good question.
As you're thinking about that, I have an example just because it's, as you were telling the story, it made me think of, I went to Yosemite last year for the first time and saw there's a little sequoia grove there. And like seeing a sequoia tree that is like 2,000 years old, like it really is a spiritual feeling almost of being like in the presence of these beings that are, our lives are like 5 seconds to them, like they've been here so much longer than before I was born. They will probably be here long after I'm gone, hopefully, if we treat the earth well enough. But it was also really interesting to learn about how like sequoias use forest fires. Like it's part of their life cycle. Yeah. Like that's how they reproduce is like, and I'm going to butcher the facts here because I just heard this from like park rangers and anyway, but like basically the cones only open in heat. And so like the life cycle of the trees like expects there to be fires that will open those, like clear the underbrush and open the cones for that to happen. And like in California especially, like there's been historically over the basically since colonialism, like a push to eradicate fires at all costs, which like on one hand, absolutely, they're terribly destructive and no one wants that, but like that is the actual cycle of what this land is, and like there is a reason why they like why California burns, and it's like the indigenous people like understood that and didn't build settlements where that was going to happen, and so but anyway, that was probably the coolest tree that I've like seen in person was one of those sequoias. So what about you?
I mean, those are hard to beat. I've seen some of the big ones out west. There's actually about 2 hours from where I live here in Asheville, North Carolina. There's a small old growth forest called the Joyce Kilmer Memorial Forest near where the Eastern Band Cherokee koala boundary is. And you can go there and see large, they're not as big as the huge trees on the West Coast, but you can see like 400-year-old, huge, massive, like 20-foot circumference trees. Wow. And not a lot of people realize that the East Coast used to be covered with that kind of stuff. Like, like those huge trees weren't just a West Coast thing. Like the East Coast was covered with a lot of that stuff as well. And those are really cool to see. I also really love bonsai, tiny little trees that you can shape into whatever. And like some of them are so old, they've like lost track of how old they are. They're like hundreds of years old and they're just like these tiny little.
That's so cool.
I love trees that are like hanging on for dear life at like the top of a mountain.
The motivational poster type tree.
Yeah, exactly. But they're so easy to like just ignore, like they're just there. But yet they're like a fundamental part of human life. Like we live in symbiotic relationship with trees in a lot of places. And so to have this book, like treat them as an actual character in human lives, just kind of like all of a sudden after I read the Overstory, like every time I would see a tree, I like saw it differently, like more fundamentally. It like had a deeper understanding of like what it was and cared about like what kind it was and all of those things. So it like this is an example of a book that was like a fun read, but it like fundamentally altered the way I saw the world in a way that like made it richer and fuller and more interesting.
I know that so you live in Asheville, North Carolina, and maybe this has come out by now. I'm not sure when you're planning to release it, but I know you're working on a documentary about the hurricane that came through Asheville. And I know you were kind of there on the ground documenting the destruction and the cleanup efforts and, that process. And I'm curious if this book, like how having read this book and then seeing that kind of like destruction of landscape, like, did you look at it in a different way because of that?
I think, there was pain in losing certain trees that I kind of become attached to. This whole thing is making me sound like such a massive hippie, but like legitimately, there was a little patch of woods near where I lived that I would walk through, multiple times a week. And you sort of, if you walk through the same patch of forest a lot, you become kind of attached to certain trees. There's like bigger ones. And there was several in this woods, like a solid like quarter of the woods was destroyed. And one of the biggest ones snapped in half and fell over. And it was sad because those kinds of like the way that space is fundamentally altered, was like kind of surprising in a sense. Like you expect those things to change. That like the life of a tree, like everything else, is impermanent. But for some reason that space, you're like, this thing has been around for 400 years or 200 or whatever. It feels like there's a solidity to that. And then, having those things gone, there was one tree that fell down and I counted the rings and I was like, this one survived the last storm. That was like the last time the record was set in like 1917. It was around, and then it fell over in this storm. So I don't know. Like that was an interesting thing. That one big tree that fell over, like a bunch of people put like stuff around it when it fell down. Like obviously other people in the neighborhood had grown attached to it as well too. But the landscape was really altered. There's certain hikes on mountains where you didn't really have a view before. And now, like a bunch of the trees just fell down on one side of the mountain. So you can like see out, and there's like, that's sad, but then also you get like a new sense of the space.
Right. And property values probably go up, right?
Yeah.
Let's keep our eyes on the
for
prize
those people.
here.
Yeah, that's what matters. That's really what matters. But no. I was surprised, of all the things we lost, that certainly was like one of the less important, but I was surprised how I was like struck. There was this one tree down by the river that I would go like several times I would like go and had low branches. You could sit in it, and the whole thing just washed away. Like it carved the bank out and the whole tree just washed away. And I was like, wow. That tree, I'll never see that tree again. Like, wow. So anyway, I do love trees, and partially thanks to Richard Powers.
All right. So that brings us to your third book. What have you got?
Okay.
And of course, like, what were the other ones that almost made the cut?
Yeah. This is not going to be my pick, but I really wanted to hit you with Infinite Jest.
Wait, is that falling? It looks like it's falling apart. In half.
Yeah, but I bought not because I've read it so much. I did. Okay. I bought it used, and it fell apart.
I see. Okay. Yeah, were there any fun notes in there for like? That's one of the best things about buying a used book is like, and I feel like that book in particular is the sort of one where like people will scribble in. Yes. So I'm curious if there was any little mementos from the previous owner.
I don't know if there's any from the previous owner. There is a memento from one of my reads. I have a note here that says, this evaluation of why video calling failed is almost 100% right. Also Snapchat.
That is, I mean, let's take a moment. So
we should briefly talk about it.
We should briefly talk about it. I do love that book. We've talked about David Foster Wallace on previous episodes before, and obviously he was very, like, in his personal life, bad person. And his art in some ways reflects that, and so it's a complicated relationship with him, but I do think that he was uniquely gifted at describing what it feels like to be alive in America in the information age. And what you just touched on specifically was one of the things that like blew my mind the most about Infinite Jest, which is this book came out in 1996, and he talks about, he projects video calling taking off, becoming a thing, and then people being like, actually, we hate this, and stopping to do it. And so it sounds like that's what your note was referencing. Yeah.
Like down to, I think he even describes something that's like really similar to like face filters. Like in the version of video calling he imagines, like people just eventually replace their entire faces because they don't want to like look at themselves or each other. No, there's a lot about that book, and part of why I brought it up here was because not to call you out on your own podcast, but you were like semi-responsible for me reading that book.
I was wondering, I couldn't remember if my recommendation played a role.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly how it went. I think I had started reading some of his other stuff, and then you sort of like goaded me on to actually read Infinite Jest. But yeah. I mean, it's obviously complicated, and there's a lot. It's a hard one to. I think that's why it falls by the wayside, because it's not a book I ultimately would be like, hey, everybody should read. You
have to. Yeah, I agree.
But it is a book that like it still lingers a lot in my mind in a lot of ways. There's scenes from it that I think about, and one of the things that I think like was really interesting for me about that book was reading it was part of what helped me understand some pathological forms of thinking in my own mind. So like seeing him play out on the page, like certain forms of like anxiety, or like internal rumination. And I like recognized like a pattern that I would feel in my head on the page in a way that nobody else had ever like articulated. And it was in a character that was like, I felt critical of. And then suddenly I was like, uh-oh, like I probably don't want that pattern to be playing out in myself. Yeah. So, there's a weird tension there between like, obviously that was coming from within him, and we can look at the issues that he had and the way he lived that was not how we want to live, not what we want to promote. But there can still sometimes be a value in like almost like a warning within that.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways he's a cautionary tale.
Yeah.
Like, and I think that like part of why that book is 10,000 pages long is because it, in very painstaking detail, recreates like thought spirals.
Yes.
Of just like getting kind of obsessed with something and then not being able to like pull yourself away from it.
Yeah.
And specifically getting obsessed with like how fucked up things are, I no, not to call you out. I remember you wrote a short story. It was about someone in like Walmart, looking at like all of the aloe vera, like all the jars, the bottles of aloe vera, and then just like starting to think about like, how did that get here? How many trucks did it take to ship this to the Walmart facility? Where was the production facility? Where did the plastic come to make the bottles? Where did they harvest the aloe vera plants? Who was working on those farms? And it's just like, everything that's surrounding us, like this laptop I'm looking at right now, it's like, oh man, where did the raw materials come from? What sort of terrible things happened that like made that happen? And then now am I, implicated because I'm using this laptop, blah, blah, blah. And you can really start to like, just absolutely spin out. And like, there is a usefulness in examining those topics, but only to a point.
And you don't want to get lost in that kind of just like recursive, thinking. It's not helping you or other people if you just like get endlessly stuck in that headspace. You have to be able to like ground yourself in reality, take a step back from the sort of like deconstruction of like everything. I think, in order to be like a functional, sane, human adult.
And that's what we want here at Shoulda Books. We want functional, sane human adults.
Yeah.
Okay, so what is so it wasn't Infinite Jest.
Okay, yes,
as the third one. What is the actual third one? Unless you got another little one you want to sneak in there.
That's no. Well, I mean, I could actually sneak one more in if you want.
This podcast.
I don't know how are we doing on time. How are we doing on time?
Let's do it quick. Let's do it quick.
Okay, we'll do it quick. Very quickly, I'll mention No One Is Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood.
Oh, I don't know.
Have you ever heard of this?
No.
Okay. So this is a book. How do I describe this? It's kind of about the internet. It's kind of about her, if I remember correctly, it's been a while since I read it. I think her sister is like having a child in the book. It's written in this very like staccato, like short chunks of like individual thoughts that are kind of almost unrelated, but like there's a narrative that slowly plays out across that. It's very informed by like Twitter and the sort of like speech and language and like mode of thinking. It's a very online sort of book, and that's the part of the what no one is talking about that's referred to by the title. She's like reflecting on just the absurdity of internet culture and the weird disconnect between like the absurdity of what's happening online and the sort of like reality of what's happening in person. And the book really captures the sort of just like fragmented, like just chaotic thinking that, or not thinking, but just like the way everything feels broken into like a million tiny pieces.
Yeah.
That has really been like a prominent feature of, I think, like life for people who have been very online for the last.
Absolutely. I mean, that goes back to what we were talking about earlier about like the medium being the message and stuff like that. And it's like, if what we are consuming is, a daily intake of 10,000 tiny little thoughts that aren't connected in any way, then like, I think it stands to reason our thinking is going to start to mirror that in a way where it's like, I don't know. I run into this problem where I'm trying to get work done and I have my like list of all the things to do. And like, I'll spend 30 seconds on one thing and then it's like, oh wait, but then this other thing. And then I switch to that. And then like an hour goes by and I've halfway done 4 tasks, but haven't finished any of them, and it starts. And I feel like I didn't used to be that way. I used to be able to focus a lot more. And so I feel like, I don't know I don't want to be the guy who's just like, blames TikTok for everything. But I do think that like consuming a lot of discrete bits of like completely unrelated information in a very short amount of time, probably not that good for you.
Yeah. It definitely changes the way you think or function. Probably letting like a commercially driven algorithm decide what those pieces of content is right. Like is not good. It's also really funny and kind of in some ways insightful. Like there's one bit where she's reflecting on the fact that kind of like I don't know when it started, but there was this trend of everybody's haircuts, like hipster haircuts, kind of started looking like neo-Nazi, like shaving the side of the head. Do you remember that?
Oh, I remember that. Yeah.
And she's like reflecting back on that, and she's like, shouldn't we have been more skeptical of that? Like we thought we were reclaiming that in some kind of way, like, but she's seeing that as like a portending like what was to come. And it's like, it's very funny. And also a little, she has some genuine, like interesting reflections on culture and stuff like that as well.
I'm really interested in this. Yeah. This sounds very, very much right up my alley.
The real one is East of Eden, which I don't have a physical copy of, but I know kind of cliche that I'm trying to compensate for that by having all these other like obscure picks, I guess. It's
okay to have mainstream taste.
I came to Steinbeck late, and it was kind of one of those where like I felt like I discovered the Beatles at like 30 or something. I was like,
have you guys heard
this guy writes great books? And everybody's like, yeah, we've known that. Duh.
Yeah. I started East of Eden. Okay. I got maybe 100 pages in, And I think I have no idea where that copy of the book ended up. I think I physically lost it and then never tracked it down, and regret it because I did enjoy it, but it was very it was too much book for where I was at in life. My life was a little too chaotic to like really sit down and be like, okay, I'm going to read this like thick book. But I've seen the movie, love the movie. James Dean, turns out the guy could really act. Who knew? But why is this one of the books that you think everyone should read?
How do I describe it? It's just part of why I was hesitant to pick it is because there's so many people who are obsessed with this book and a lot of people who probably could like speak to it with a lot better justice than I could. But I read it like last year and it was the first Steinbeck I had ever read and just fell in love with like the way he articulates characters and the world. It spans a lot of time. We get to follow these characters across like a full generation. And I also really fell in love with like the sense of place, which he does. I've since started reading Grapes of Wrath, although I'm kind of having the problem, I think, right now with Grapes of Wrath that it sounds like you were having with East of Eden, where I'm just like, this is like a lot of book, especially if you're already a little bit depressed.
Yes.
Grapes of Wrath just piles it on thick. But yeah, he just has a really I just like his use of language. You know, he has those little like ticks as a writer, like the way he repeats certain things where you're just like, why does that work? Like, I don't know. You can't explain it, but for some reason it just like, there's a rhythm to it. And then he does this in some of his other books, but in East of Eden as well, has these like, these sort of like vignettes that will like describe part of what's happening in the environment that's surrounding the characters. Like he really places the characters within a context, and like does that in such a beautiful way. You really feel like you're being immersed in the reality that surrounded the characters. I love, that's something I love in any media that I consume, when it has like what feels like a little bit of like an anthropological element where the author was like, I'm not just telling you this story, I'm trying to like describe this place and what it was like to be in that place in that time. And East of Eden really has that.
Yeah, I know that was something that he was clearly interested in and tried to do in his writing, is like, that's the 100 or so pages or so that I've read of that. I've read that. Oh, I've also read Of Mice and Men, and I really liked Mice and Men, but it's been so many years. Yeah. I remember something about bunnies, and that's about it. But no, he clearly like had a fascination with America and the American West, and like wanted to really like capture that place in all of its like messiness and brutality and general like greed and avarice. Is that I mean, that certainly comes through in the movie of East of Eden. Like, is that something that he really dives into deeply in this book? What's
at the core of the book is kind of like this struggle between good and evil. It kind of, I mean, he's very obviously like remixing themes of like Cain and Abel, the Cain and Abel story, which I think is really interesting, because if you're familiar with that story and you like, there was a certain point in the book where I was like, oh, I see where this is going.
Oh,
and
interesting.
Like,
okay.
And that had a certain like dread and like suspense attached to it. And I was like, there felt like there was this inevitability to how things were going to play out. And like, I dreaded that, but like I couldn't, but I wanted to see, but it's not just like his version of that. He's like really interrogating that story and what it means, and like, you know, whether or not we as humans, whether or not like the struggle between good and evil is something that's, or like whether or not good is like destined within us, or if that's something we can choose, and what those things even mean. Yeah, he explores that really richly, I think. And I like, he writes character with like he lets them be really complicated and kind of messy and nuanced in a way that has that like no actual human makes any kind of logical sense. Like if you know enough about the person, they're kind of like, you know, like you can sort of put your finger on them. You're like, okay, I see what's going on with this person. And then there'll just be like a couple things where you're like, how does this and this like go together? And I think some writers, their characters are almost like too logical. Like they're too like, you know, oh, I understand what type of person this is. Like I can put them in the little box that's like this type of character. Yeah. Or they're like too scattered and it feels like, you know, just like disconnected choices that don't have like a motivation to them. Yeah. But he like finds that like perfect middle where like a character will do something incredibly surprising and you feel like, oh yes, of course that's what that character would do. But like I never saw that coming. I don't know. It's hard to describe.
No, I think that you really put your finger on something that I don't know if I've ever like quite heard articulated in the same way, of just like, that is like the key to writing a really good character, because that's the key to like what people are, is like we are not these like purely rational beings. We're like semi-rational, but, or more accurately, probably, I think we make decisions emotionally and then use like logic to like justify them after the fact. Yeah. You know? Yeah, that's really fascinating. I want to read more of his writing and see how he kind of does that.
I think the like latter half of the book is better than the first. So if you revisit it, that's something.
If I ever find that that copy, yeah. It's funny because like it was one of the books that I brought it when I first moved to California, and so like that was when I started reading it. Was like my first, I don't know, 3 or 4 months in Los Angeles. And it was very like a conscious decision of like, this is a California story. I'm in California now. I'm going to, you know, my life's a movie, blah, blah, blah. But maybe it'll be a Shoulda book on the book club at some point. So, but
well, in my opinion, it should be, because I think everyone should read it. And this is the one book where like I read it and then I told everyone in my life about it. Yeah. And my mother read it, my brother read it, my wife read it, a friend of mine in the Netherlands read it, and all of them liked it. So wow. Okay. I have a good track record with recommending this book to people and having them like it, because it's just one of the best books ever written. I mean, so yeah.
Okay. Well, it sounds like you're kind of due for a dissenting voice.
Look, sound off in the comment. The people who love this book know, and you're going to get comments, I'm sure, from people who are like, love this book, because the people who know this book is like, if you know, you know. Yeah. I'm sure there's people who hate it, but like, sure, a lot of people have a specific relationship to this book. It is the kind of book where I'm like, I could see myself rereading it at some point, which is rare. I don't do that often.
You said you read it like a year ago?
Last year, yeah.
Do you think you would have enjoyed it as much if you'd read it earlier?
That's a good question. I don't know. I think it's possible. I think I would have enjoyed this as a younger person. But there's definitely like a maturity to it that I think I appreciate more now than I would have. I'm glad it was my introduction to Steinbeck. I think a lot of people are introduced to Grapes of Wrath, which is also, of what I've read, I haven't finished it yet, but like also incredible. But is like heavier, and if you have that thrust on you as a young person, I think it like sometimes that can like put you off of an author. Yeah. If you're like forced to read something that's like a little beyond what you can digest.
Right.
Sometimes that's great, and we should do that to kids. But like, I'm glad I got to discover all the little like things that make his writing magical in this story specifically. I'm sure the people who love Grapes of Wrath maybe are disagree, but
the grape. I'm trying to come up with the bunches, the bunches of grape.
The Okies.
Sound off in the comments. Yeah. These, I think, were some fantastic recommendations. The official ones and the unofficial ones.
You say that to every guest.
The mental to be read list is starting to create one of those kind of thought loops that we talked about earlier, where I'm just like, oh my God, there's so many books to read, and I am only, if I extrapolate like, life expectancy, I only have this many years left, and if I read this many blah blah blah, and so like that's not healthy, but that's the burden that I bear, it's time now. I'm trying to come up with a smoother transition, but I didn't. If you have your digital brown paper package, open the text. 2 texts from Jonathan. Well, yeah. Hey, that's me. All right. The book is. Oh, should I open it now? Yes, you should open it. Okay. Milkman by Anna Burns. I've not heard of this. This was a book that I read a couple years ago and was absolutely blown away by it. It's a novel, and it's set in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, and it's the like inner monologue of this young woman, and it's told in a very lyrical way. It's like, that's really the only way I can describe it. Is like, it just feels like music as you're reading it. But she's living in this Northern Irish community, and one of the members of the local IRA chapter, the Milkman, takes a fancy to her and wants to like start dating her, and she wants nothing to do with any of that. And because she like rejects him, it sets off this like chain of events that draws her kind of into the fray, into the battle. And it's a really interesting formal exercise, because like the thing they tell you when you're, taking any sort of writing class is your protagonist cannot be passive. They cannot be passive. All this woman wants to do is be passive. She does not want to be involved. Yeah. She does not want to do anything. And it works beautifully. And it's also really interesting too, because like no one has names. She just describes them like she has several sisters. So she has like she has older sister, younger sister, and then wee sisters who are like, she's like twins who are younger. And like the guy she's dating, she just calls maybe boyfriend. And so it's a really fascinating from like a technical standpoint, but it has a lot to say about like division and polarized politics, and so I think it's extremely relevant to right now. But yes, I am going to mail you a copy. Cool. Yeah, that sounds right up my alley. Well, thank you so much for hopping into this episode. What am I saying? Thank you for being here. Do you have anything to plug? Where can the people find you, et cetera, et cetera? My work is all over the place. You can find my YouTube video essays, mostly about film, on YouTube, Thomas Flight on there. I write a little bit about movies and other stuff on my newsletter at seeingthroughfilm.com. The newsletter is also the easiest way to find updates about the documentary that you were talking about, which isn't out yet. Okay. It'll be out sometime in 2026, most likely. And that's about how community responds to climate disaster. So yeah, just check out Thomas Flight online. You'll find me. Awesome. Well, thank you, Thomas. And thank you everyone for listening and watching, and keep reading.